What happens when a young ruler, barely 24 years of age, gains colossal power over the largest empire in the known world? What happens when the entire might of an empire, stretching from the shores of Britain to the lands of Syria, is concentrated in the hands of one man whose will knows neither bounds nor limitations? This young man was Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, whose name would forever be known as Caligula. His image became the embodiment of exorbitant excesses, boundless cruelty, and unbridled power. For centuries, historical chronicles have portrayed him as a depraved tyrant and monster who transformed the imperial throne into an arena for his insane acts. Yet, a careful examination of ancient sources, combined with modern archaeological discoveries, raises a pertinent question. Was he truly the monstrous figure he is depicted as, or merely a victim of political intrigues and conspiracies that necessitated his demonization to justify his subsequent downfall? Imagine the cobbled streets of Rome in 37 AD. Vendors offer wine in bustling taverns, priests carry offerings to the majestic temple of Jupiter, and rumors spread through the city like unseen currents of air between marble columns and wooden balconies. The people rejoice at the death of Tiberius, the aged ruler who had spent over 2 decades in seclusion on the island of Capri, and harbor great hopes that the new emperor will usher in a long-awaited golden age. In the throng, Caligula's name is uttered with faith and enthusiasm. No one could have then imagined that, within just a few years, this name would be whispered with fear and dread. What unfolds is not merely a chronicle of a reign, but a panorama of a social experiment pushed to its critical point. To what extent can power become unrestrained when its checks and balances lose their force? How does society become complicit in the abuses of one individual, whether through fear or an unwillingness to voice dissent? This lies at the heart of Caligula's enigma, a history woven from the intertwining threads of reality and propaganda, hostile accounts and material artifacts. It continues 2 millennia later to provoke reflection on our relationship with power. Rome, spring, 37 AD. The city held its breath in anticipation. The demise of Tiberius at his villa on Capri marked the end of over 2 decades of rule, a period rife with repression and fear. His prolonged seclusion, guarded by an army of informants, had fostered an atmosphere of pervasive suspicion. Following his death, Rome seemed to shed a heavy burden that had constrained public life. The Roman Forum, the epicenter of political life, stirred back to life. Merchants eagerly offered their wares as if sensing the dawn of a new era. The temple columns, blackened by sacrificial soot, appeared renewed. The populace gathered around heralds who proclaimed the accession of Germanicus's grandson, a war hero beloved by soldiers and the common folk alike. Rome, the eternal city, presented itself as a kaleidoscope of striking contrasts. In the cramped insulae, where large families huddled in a single room, the constant threat of fire loomed, capable of instantly reducing flimsy 5-story wooden structures to ashes. Yet, just a few steps from these squalid tenements, in opulent aristocratic homes, one's gaze would fall upon fragrant gardens adorned with damask roses, elegant marble fountains, and mosaic panels depicting ancient Greek myths. The capital of a vast empire was a curious blend of dazzling luxury and stark poverty, architectural magnificence and urban chaos. On the Capitoline Hill, within the Temple of Jupiter, Optimus Maximus, solemn sacrifices were performed. Snow-white bulls, adorned with golden ribbons, heralded an era of prosperity to the sound of triumphant hymns. At the foot of the Forum, in the Temple of Vesta, the sacred fire burned perpetually, guarded by Vestal virgins who symbolized purity and safeguarded Rome's welfare. Religion permeated all spheres of public life. Events unfolding on the Palatine Hill were reflected on the altars, and occurrences within the temples had the power to predetermine the emperor's very destiny. Among the 7 hills upon which Rome stretched, the city transformed into a political barometer. The enthusiastic applause that greeted the young Caligula sounded sincere, yet it was not without strategic calculation. The people saw in him the son of the adored Germanicus. The Senate placed hopes on him for reconciliation, and the soldiers acclaimed him as the descendant of one of their most celebrated commanders. In those March days, Rome was brimming with confidence in the dawn of a new era. However, no one could have imagined that, in this promising spring, the seeds of a coming storm were already sown, a storm that would, in just 4 years, transform the city into an arena of terror and violence. At the very heart of the Roman Forum, not far from the majestic Senate House and the triumphal arch of Augustus, stood the Temple of Vesta, one of the most revered sites in ancient Rome. Its unusual circular form, distinguishing it from other Roman temples, embodied the idea of eternity and the unbroken continuity of the city's history. Within the temple, a sacred fire burned perpetually, considered the very soul of Rome. The maintenance of this eternal flame was entrusted to 6 chosen women, the Vestal virgins, whose lives belonged entirely not to themselves, but to the prosperity of the empire. The vow taken by the Vestal virgins held not only religious but also significant political importance. Their inviolability symbolized the sanctity and grandeur of Rome. Any breach of this vow was considered an ominous portent foretelling the city's downfall. Thus, their chastity was not a personal choice, but a sacred duty to the entire Roman people. Violation of this vow incurred a terrifying punishment. The Vestal was buried alive in an underground chamber, while a silent crowd observed the tragic spectacle. However, despite these stringent requirements, Vestal virgins enjoyed exceptional privileges in a society where women's roles were typically confined to the domestic sphere. They had the right to own property, draw up wills, and grant freedom to slaves, and their testimony in court was valued equally with that of 2 men. Vestals were accompanied by lictors, and even consuls bowed before them as a mark of respect. In fact, these women stood above ordinary laws, being simultaneously objects of veneration and awe-inspiring figures. During Caligula's reign, Cornelia Maxima, known as the Virgo Vestalis Maxima, exemplified devotion and piety, having served the goddess Vesta for over 3 decades. Her strictness and unwavering authority were widely recognized. Serving alongside her in the temple were young women from noble Roman families, such as Claudia Pulchra, a young lady from the imperial family, and Livia Octavia, a descendant of Augustus himself. These girls, having undergone a rigorous selection process based on auguries and complex rituals, were not merely guardians of the sacred fire, they safeguarded Rome's religious and political stability. The relationship between the Palatine Hill, where the emperor's residence was located, and the Temple of Vesta had always been characterized by delicacy and diplomacy. While emperors exercised earthly power, the Vestal virgins ensured divine support. This balance was extremely vulnerable, and no emperor could afford a conflict with the Vestals, fearing it would undermine the foundations of Roman tradition. However, Caligula's reign posed a serious test to this equilibrium. In him, the religious inviolability of the Vestals confronted unchecked power, raising one of the most acute questions of the era. To what extent could an emperor indulge in arbitrary rule before violating even the most sacred institutions? To comprehend the personality of the young ruler who ascended the throne of the Roman Empire in 37 AD, one must delve into the origins of his life, to a childhood woven from the bright threads of glory, tragic shadows, and unceasing fear. Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, better known as Caligula, was born into a family that held a unique position in Roman society, a family surrounded by universal reverence yet simultaneously exposed to mortal danger. His father, Germanicus, was an outstanding military commander whose charisma captivated hearts and whose victories in the German lands brought him fame and the affection of soldiers and common people alike. His very presence on the battlefield instilled confidence and boosted the morale of the legions. However, the widespread love and recognition enjoyed by Germanicus bred envy in the heart of Tiberius, the reigning emperor, who saw in his nephew a potential threat to his own power. In 19 AD, when Gaius was just 7 years old, Germanicus died under highly mysterious circumstances. Historical chronicles recount deathbed convulsions, dark vomit, and strange amulets discovered on his deathbed. Many suspected he had fallen victim to poisoning, orchestrated on the orders of Tiberius himself. The news of Germanicus's demise sparked a storm of grief and despair among Roman citizens. People mourned their hero in the streets, soldiers erected impromptu altars in his honor, and Germanicus's name became a symbol of lost hopes and widespread sorrow. For the young Gaius, his early life was marked by tragic events that overshadowed his childhood. His mother, Agrippina the Elder, the celebrated granddaughter of the divine Augustus, was a woman of unyielding will. She openly accused Tiberius of complicity in her husband's death, which rendered her persona non grata at the imperial court. The emperor's reaction was swift. Agrippina was exiled to the island of Pandateria, where she died of exhaustion after long years of confinement. In young Caligula's mind, Rome appeared not as the center of the civilized world, but as a stage for treacherous betrayals and intrigues. He spent his adolescence on the island of Capri in the company of Tiberius. There, in the aged emperor's luxurious residence, he witnessed firsthand an atmosphere of pervasive suspicion and moral decay. According to Suetonius and Dio Cassius, Capri had become a place where executions were a commonplace spectacle and court intrigues a daily occupation. Gaius quickly adapted to this environment, learning the cardinal lesson: weakness was unacceptable. His fondness for the miniature military sandals he wore in his father's army camps earned him the nickname Caligula, meaning little boot, which stuck with him for life. Tiberius himself, shrewdly assessing the boy's character, famously called him a snake reared for the Roman people. And he was not mistaken. It was on Capri that Caligula realized politics was a theater where a dagger could hide behind a smiling mask, and feigned obedience was the only way to survive. Thus was forged the personality of a young man who, at 24, was destined to inherit not only the imperial throne, but also all the neuroses of the ruling dynasty, permeated by suspicion, cruelty, and fear. When, in March 37 AD, Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, better known as Caligula, ascended the throne of the Roman Empire, Jubilation swept through the eternal city. Commoners, exhausted by Tiberius's harsh rule, saw in Germanicus's son not only the rightful inheritor of his military prowess, but also the harbinger of a new era of prosperity, comparable to the times of Augustus. Soldiers, loyal to his father's memory, greeted him as a continuation of glorious traditions, and the Senate, at least publicly, welcomed him as a restorer of balance between imperial power and the aristocracy. Caligula's initial months of rule fully justified the hopes placed upon him. He halted the political processes initiated under Tiberius, freed the unjustly condemned, suppressed the activities of informants, and restored the good names of families who had suffered from repression. His generosity seemed boundless, as if the empire's treasury had no bottom. He showered the plebs with gifts, hosted lavish feasts, and organized spectacular games that lasted for several days consecutively. The people hailed him as the rising sun of Rome, a symbol of hope and renewal. The city, accustomed to the oppressive silence of previous years, was once again filled with joyful shouts, songs, and festive processions. Caligula, surrounded by an adoring crowd, walked through the streets, showered in flowers and greetings. His popularity reached such heights that, according to Philo of Alexandria, altars were erected in his honor even in distant provinces. The spectacles were astonishing in their magnificence and scale: gladiatorial contests, thrilling chariot races, and exotic hunts for wild animals imported from Africa. The young emperor spared no expense in staging these lavish events, which seemed to herald a revival of the Augustan Golden Age. Initially, despite some wariness regarding his ostentatious generosity, the Roman elite dared not openly oppose Caligula, fearing they would be branded enemies of the people. It seemed Rome had found in him a leader capable of uniting various social strata and reviving its former glory, which had faded during Tiberius's reign. In those months, Rome experienced a period of widespread enthusiasm and almost manic optimism. But, unfortunately, this rosy mood was short-lived. In October of that same year, Caligula suddenly fell ill, and a high fever confined him to bed for several weeks. After his recovery, the emperor whom Rome had so adored changed beyond recognition. Historical sources unanimously assert that the illness marked a pivotal turning point in his rule. In October 37 AD, just 8 months after his accession, Caligula fell seriously ill. The causes of his illness remain unclear to this day. Suetonius mentions a severe fever, while Dio Cassius describes delirium and a clouding of his faculties. Modern researchers speculate it could have been encephalitis, epilepsy, or even poisoning. For several weeks, Rome was gripped by anxious anticipation. The young emperor, only 24 years old, fought desperately for his life. The Senate, concerned for the stability of the state, began to discuss possible successors. Meanwhile, the common people flocked to the temples, offering prayers to Jupiter, Aesculapius, and even foreign gods in the hope of his miraculous recovery. Historical sources tell us that during his illness, Emperor Caligula, on the brink of death, uttered the names of Eastern deities, previously unknown to the Roman pantheon, as if seeking support beyond the capabilities of traditional Roman gods. Physicians of the time, employing all available methods, from cleansing enemas and bloodletting to concocting infusions from rare herbs, applying magical amulets, and offering solemn prayers, strove to restore the emperor to life. However, despite all efforts, Caligula's condition remained unchanged. Then, suddenly, Against all expectations, he was able to rise from his bed. Yet, according to those close to him, the experience of illness left an indelible mark on his personality. The former generous youth who staged lavish spectacles and showered the people with gifts vanished. In his place emerged a man who had known the proximity of death. Some chroniclers assert that Caligula began to consider himself reborn not merely as an emperor, but as a divine being, which explains his obsessive pursuit of the title Dominus et Deus, Lord and God. What was once an era of universal jubilation gradually transformed into a reign founded on fear, unrestrained extravagance, and unchecked power. That ill-fated autumn fever not only undermined the emperor's health, but also fundamentally altered the course of the Roman Empire's history. Following his recovery in the autumn of 37 AD, Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, better known as Caligula, appeared before the Romans in a completely different guise, like a distorted reflection of the young man they had once adored. Exchanging the image of a universal savior for the mask of an unpredictable and cruel despot, he plunged Rome into a state of anxiety and uncertainty. The first signs of the impending tragedy manifested in his sharp mood swings and pathological suspicion. As the historian Dio Cassius notes, Caligula lost his sense of humor and could not tolerate even the slightest criticism, perceiving treason in every word and action. He ruthlessly dealt with those who dared to discuss possible successors during his illness, deeming political foresight a vile conspiracy against his person. Gratitude towards the Senate and allies was replaced by searing resentment, as if he harbored a plan for revenge over perceived insults. Suetonius, the renowned Roman writer and historian, asserts that Caligula, having come to believe in his divine nature, demanded worship as a living god. He insisted on being addressed as Dominus et Deus, Lord and God, a title that even Augustus himself had not dared to claim. By his command, statues bearing his likeness were erected in all temples, where he appeared in the guise of Jupiter, Apollo, or even Venus, blurring the boundaries between male and female, between the sacred and the profane. Extravagance became another striking manifestation of his transformation. If, in the initial months of his reign, he had spent money generously to win the people's affection, he now squandered state resources on absurd and meaningless projects, demonstrating complete disregard for the empire's needs. Caligula, whose name soon became synonymous with madness and despotism, left behind a trail of scandalous deeds that astonished his contemporaries. The most extravagant of his projects was a floating bridge across the Bay of Baiae, constructed from connected ships. This bridge, intended to immortalize Caligula's triumph in the spirit of Alexander the Great, drained the treasury to its limits, depriving entire provinces of sustenance. Concurrently, dark rumors enveloped the emperor's personal life. There were whispers of incest with his sisters, of senators being coerced into shameful acts at banquets, and of the imperial court being transformed into a den of debauchery. Despite warnings from modern historians about the possible exaggeration of these accusations, one fact remained evident. In the eyes of the Romans, Caligula had transformed from a golden youth into a capricious tyrant. The city, which had once praised him as a new son, now trembled with fear. The era of hope had given way to an era of terror. However, power in Rome rested not solely on military might and financial flows. It was deeply rooted in religious beliefs, in the conviction that the gods favored the empire as long as sacred rituals were observed. Among all religious institutions, the College of Vestal Virgins held a special place, surrounded by both reverence and awe. The 6 priestesses of the Temple of Vesta, guardians of the eternal flame, symbolized the very soul of Rome. Their virginity embodied the city's purity, and the vow of chastity was so sacred that its violation was punishable by burial alive. The Vestal Virgins, guardians of Rome's sacred fire, wielded immense authority and influence. Their word was law, their presence evoked awe, and even consuls bowed before them in deference. However, in 38 AD, just a year after his recovery, Caligula turned his attention to this inviolable stronghold of ancient traditions. According to Dio Cassius and fragments attributed to Philo of Alexandria, the emperor began inviting the Vestal Virgins to lavish feasts, cleverly disguised as religious celebrations. In the flickering light of torches, surrounded by trembling senators, the young ruler staged theatrical performances based on mythological themes, in which the priestesses were assigned roles bordering on sacrilege. A particular concern is raised by a letter attributed to Seneca the Younger, whose authenticity remains debated but is considered highly probable by many modern scholars. This letter recounts how the young Claudia Pulchra was forced to portray Leda in the scandalous myth of the swan, while the emperor himself, clad in Jupiter's attire, watched the proceedings with undisguised pleasure. Did events truly unfold in this manner? Historians caution against blindly trusting later sources, whose authors, driven by animosity towards Caligula's memory, might have exaggerated or even entirely fabricated such scenes to justify his assassination. Nevertheless, it is undeniable that this scandal left an indelible mark on the collective memory of the Romans. The emperor, in the eyes of many, had committed an act of sacrilege, violating age-old customs and traditions. Tension reached its peak when Caligula issued an unprecedented order to install his statue in the sanctuary of Vesta, in close proximity to the sacred flame. This act marked the first open rebellion of the Vestal Virgins against the emperor's will. Cornelia Maxima, the chief Vestal, clad in ritual robes, appeared before Caligula on the Palatine and delivered a speech full of unwavering resolve that astonished even her detractors. Purity submits not to human whims, but to the dictates of the gods. This audacious defiance was so extraordinary that, despite his surging fury, Caligula did not dare to condemn the Vestals to public execution. Nevertheless, the message was abundantly clear. His boundless power had met an insurmountable obstacle, one stemming from the divine. From that moment onwards, rumors spread through Rome like an invisible poison, suggesting that the emperor had jeopardized the divine protection safeguarding the city. Following his confrontation with the Vestals, Caligula further solidified his strategy of absolute domination. Those who naively believed he would halt before religious barriers soon realized that the emperor recognized no limits, neither divine nor human. The Senate became his primary target. This venerable institution, which had governed Rome for centuries, was transformed into an arena of humiliation. Caligula convened sessions merely to mock the senators, forcing them to run alongside his chariot in the circus like slaves, or to kiss his feet in front of crowds. Some were compelled to applaud during humiliating spectacles where their wives or daughters were put up for auction, with the emperor acting as the cynical auctioneer. Caligula was by no means gentle in his dealings with his closest associates. Cassius Chaerea, a tribune in the Praetorian Guard, recalled with deep resentment how the emperor, to mock him, chose feminine names for military passwords, such as Venus or Love. Such a seemingly innocuous jest inflicted a deep wound on the self-esteem of a distinguished warrior. The common people also did not escape the young ruler's oppression. After the treasury was depleted by his unrestrained feasts and absurd ventures, Caligula imposed exorbitant taxes on the citizens. Virtually everything was subject to taxation, marriages and lawsuits, public baths, and even brothels. The emperor's avarice reached such proportions that even those sections of the populace who had previously experienced his generosity now viewed him as a ruthless plunderer. Executions became commonplace. Suetonius and Dio Cassius recount how Caligula took pleasure in watching torture during banquets, ordering executions between courses to entertain his guests. The Palatine transformed into a sinister theater of terror. Senators, military commanders, commoners, and even members of the imperial family lived in constant dread. No one could feel safe, fearing sudden accusations, misinterpreted gestures, or the emperor's fleeting whim. Rome, which had once bowed before him as the sun of its empire, now saw him more as an unpredictable volcano whose dazzling brilliance captivated but could at any moment turn into a destructive eruption. By early 41 AD, imperial Rome was suffocating in an atmosphere of universal fear. The Senate had been reduced to a mere puppet. The Praetorian Guard was fractured by internal strife, and the populace was exhausted under the burden of exorbitant taxes. Caligula, not yet 30 years old, had become an enemy to all strata of society, and, paradoxically, simultaneously, the most protected man in the vast empire. In the opulent corridors of the Palatine Palace and the cool halls of Agrippa's baths, plans for his overthrow began to secretly mature. The conspirators formed a colorful and disparate group: senators whose pride had been wounded, ambitious guard officers, and even members of noble families who could not forgive the emperor's public humiliations. However, the most resolute and determined leader of this group was Cassius Chaerea, the Praetorian tribune whom the emperor never missed an opportunity to mock, using insulting, effeminate passwords when speaking to him. For Chaerea, participation in the conspiracy was not merely a political act, but a matter of personal vengeance, a chance to settle scores for years of humiliation and insults. Preparations for the coup were conducted with utmost secrecy and desperate determination. The conspirators well understood that failure would mean a torturous execution for them and inevitable doom for their families. Even Vestal virgins were involved in the plot. If the assassins had claimed that Caligula's cruel deeds were sent by divine providence, their conspiracy would have lost all public and historical support. Some historical chronicles hint that the conspirators were secretly warned against revealing their true motives, though it is no longer possible to ascertain this definitively. The fateful day was 24th of January 41st AD, during the Palatine Games, after several days filled with captivating but exhausting spectacles. Caligula decided to break for lunch in his private chambers. The path there led through a narrow corridor, its walls adorned with frescoes depicting the military triumphs of his ancestors. This corridor, which he had traversed countless times, became a deadly trap. It was there that Chaerea lay in wait, his sword drawn. "Take that, Caesar," he declared in a resolute voice, and plunged the blade into the emperor's neck. Caligula cried out in pain and tried to resist, but soon other conspirators joined the bloody assault. More than 30 dagger blows rained down upon him with the precision and ruthlessness of those firmly resolved to deny the emperor any chance of survival. His dying words, as Suetonius testifies, were, "I am still alive, I am still alive." The emperor's lifeless body lay sprawled on the cold marble, and ominous news, like lightning, swept through the eternal city. For some, it was an act of supreme justice, retribution for the tyrant's misdeeds. Others were seized by a superstitious dread of the gods' wrath, who might unleash their punishing fury upon Rome for the sacrilegious spilling of imperial blood. But fate had already run its course. Caligula, the first Roman emperor to fall at the hands of his own Praetorian Guard, became a symbol of a deep wound that forever altered the destiny of the Roman throne. His tragic demise did not bring the longed-for peace, but merely spawned a turbulent whirlpool of political instability and widespread uncertainty. The moment Caligula's body lay still in the corridors of the Palatine Palace, the conspirators realized that the most difficult and dangerous part was yet to come. The question of succession became acutely pressing. Who would now occupy the imperial throne? The Senate, which had long dreamed of regaining the power lost since Augustus's reign, secretly discussed the possibility of restoring the Republic. However, these unfulfilled hopes were not destined to materialize. The Praetorian Guard, fearing the loss of their privileges and influence, discovered Claudius, the murdered emperor's uncle, in the palace. Historical chronicles recount that Claudius was found in a state of extreme fright, trembling behind a curtain, and convinced of his imminent execution. But instead of death, the Praetorians proclaimed him the new princeps, thereby ensuring the continuity of the imperial monarchy and preserving their own positions in the political game. While Caligula's soul had likely already faced the judgment of history, his mortal remains suffered a final indignity. Mutilated by the assassin's daggers, his body was abandoned until a few loyal women of his family secretly retrieved the remains and buried them in the quiet of the Lamian gardens. No mournful speeches, no funeral procession, not even a humble tombstone, nothing. The Senate, as if striving to erase him from the very fabric of reality, pronounced a harsh sentence, damnatio memoriae, the condemnation of memory. Rome, it seemed, yearned to pretend that Caligula's reign had never occurred. Orders were given to destroy his statues, chisel his name from stone tablets, and expunge him from the annals of history. However, oblivion proved to be a phantom dream. Shrouded in sinister rumors of madness and exorbitant luxury, Caligula's image outlived many emperors who ascended the throne after him. The propaganda machine, intended to obliterate his legacy, inadvertently transformed him into a grim myth, a warning of where unrestricted power can lead. Damnatio memoriae, instead of consigning him to oblivion, paradoxically ensured him a peculiar immortality. Among the populace, his eccentric antics were immortalized in bawdy songs passed down by word of mouth. Senators, gathered in hushed corridors, whispered his name as the embodiment of tyranny. Historians, analyzing the past, used his reign as a grim mirror, reflecting what a ruler should absolutely not be. And so, the attempt to erase him from memory resulted in Caligula's name, having survived 2 millennia, becoming eponymous, a synonym for the corruption, madness, and excessive indulgences inherent in imperial power. The history of Caligula's reign, as if shrouded in a thick veil of conjecture and political propaganda, continues to stir the minds of researchers to this day, remaining one of the darkest pages in the annals of the Roman Empire. Greeted by the people as a long-awaited savior, he soon began to evoke widespread fear as a ruthless tyrant, and ended his life at the hands of conspirators like a true monster. However, behind these polarized assessments, from unrestrained adoration to fierce hatred, lies a far more uncomfortable and bitter truth. His era became a peculiar mirror, reflecting the mores of a society that not only tolerated but, to some extent, indulged his wild antics and eccentric whims. Ancient chroniclers, from the brilliant Suetonius to the meticulous Dio Cassius, created for posterity a sinister image of an emperor embodying all the most repulsive traits of human nature: insatiable lust, unmotivated cruelty, complete disregard for established institutions of power, and a maniacal desire for self-deification. Nevertheless, behind every line denouncing his misdeeds, political motives are clearly discernible. For it was absolutely necessary to justify his violent death and legitimize the power of those who took the reins of the empire after his tragic downfall. So, who was Caligula in reality? An absolute embodiment of evil, or a deeply traumatized youth who, by fateful chance, inherited a state afflicted by intrigues, poisonings, and pervasive paranoia? Perhaps he embodied both these aspects. The true tragedy of his life and reign lay in the fact that he either did not recognize or simply refused to acknowledge any boundaries or limitations. And when a man devoid of restraint and moral principles takes the helm of the world's most powerful empire, the consequences become truly catastrophic and, alas, inevitable. Caligula's death did not bring longed-for relief to Rome, but heralded a new era of intrigue and instability. The weakened Senate and the Praetorian Guard, now aware of their ability to enthrone and dethrone emperors, entered a struggle for power. This dangerous precedent shaped the empire's political landscape for many years. From then on, the imperial throne belonged not only to the rightful ruler, but also to those who possessed sufficient power to hold or seize it. Even 2 centuries later, as the Roman Empire was already declining, Caligula's name served as an ominous warning about the consequences of unrestrained power, steeped in tyranny and fear. 2 millennia on, his image still evokes awe and horror, reminding us that the history of Rome reflects our own susceptibility to the temptations of power. In the ashes of his tragic fate echoes a question pertinent even today: are we responsible for the tyrants we tolerate?